All right, we're back and continuing our conversation, discussions about problems in modern society, problems with our spiritual uh, lives, and how modern society has is is broken in so many ways. And we've talked a lot about the issue, what we're looking at now. We're going to be transitioning into the causes, which deals a lot with thoughts, philosophies. And in order to do that, we want to talk about some of the framework of those philosophies, some of the vocabulary of those philosophies. So we're going to talk about some of the core issues that philosophies are dealing with. Really, philosophies are asking questions. A lot of it is just asking questions about things that I think we just assume sometimes, and then we don't think about how we've arrived at the way we're thinking and the way that we're living. And philosophy sort of investigates that, and that's a worthy and valid investigation, don't you think, Caleb?
Yeah, amen. So we talked about how separation, fragmentation, these things have been pulling us apart. Um, Talked a lot about kind of some of the modern applications of that. We'll go into that more. And in discussing the philosophies, I know it can be very confusing. And Stephen and I, both of us have taught this and we've written stuff on it and trying to bring some of these things light. And oftentimes it can be very confusing because people get lost in the dates and the names and what it really means. And so we're trying to find ways to simplify it without making it overly simplistic and losing the value of teaching it. And we're not perfect. We're going to make mistakes on it, and if anybody has any feedback or critique, they can obviously let us know. But in this discussion and conversation today, we'd like to maybe try to give some tools of investigating future ones, because we're going to be talking about broad philosophies and broad social movements, but then nothing's monolithic, because we're going to break it down and then say, okay, like these are the conversations and the back and forth, the arguments that are being presented. And we want to at least have some type of tools that are going to be consistent in the analysis of that, and not, instead of having to like recreate the wheel or just not have any point of contact in terms of comparing it. So that's what we're going to try to do today, is apply some very basic, common philosophical terms. They're not just unique to philosophy. The Bible also deals with these things, maybe not in the same terminology, but the concepts are definitely there. And we want to be able to build on these concepts to provide a good point of analysis for those future philosophies and movements, so we can really get down into kind of like brass tacks and understanding what people are saying, what they said, and then what we mean in terms of how we're evaluating them. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, so three concepts, three frameworks that we're going to be talking about today are cosmology, ontology, and epistemology, which sound a lot more complicated, but they're just words that describe aspects of life that people are asking questions about, typically in philosophy. And I think it'd be good for us to start with cosmology. The Bible opens up explaining the cosmology that we live within. And so, Caleb, give us a working definition. What is cosmology?
Sure. So all three of these words, cosmology, ontology, epistemology, come from Greek words, right? Anything that ends in ology is going to be coming from logos, which for English and most Western languages, it's going to be the study of, and then whatever the prefix is. The prefix in the first one, cosmos, is talking about the order of the universe or the order of the world or system. And so we can think about just how is the universe arranged? What exists and what's in that? That's a very kind of like broad concept. So cosmology is the order of the cosmos. And as Brother Stephen mentioned, the Bible starts off talking about cosmology in the very first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So what do you have? You have heavens and earth and in this cosmos, and God is the one that's created it. And so in philosophy, you can say, well, the universe is made of whatever, or the universe is organized with people or objects or things, or fill in the blank. The way that people organize the system that they're in is going to fundamentally describe their perspective and belief about cosmology. And obviously, everyone's going to have their arguments of saying, hey, we think our cosmology is more accurate or better reflective of the universe that we see than others. But that's fundamentally the order. And every philosophy is going to have kind of a different view or take in terms of what is the center, what's the most important part, or who's in charge of, or how does it function, or what operates and keeps the cosmos ticking. All of these things about form and function and pattern are fundamentally related to this concept of the order of how people see the universe. So that's kind of my basic concept. What do you think about it, Stephen?
Yeah. So, and I think to understand the importance, the assumptions we have about cosmology are going to change the way that we interact with that cosmology, right? So if we assume a creator and we assume the creator of the Bible, like, so if you and I are following along and we believe in the Genesis 1, that God put these things into order, that he created our bodies, that we are products of his creation, then that's going to change the way that we view and then interact with the creation around us and inside of us. I mean, I just think of, from the standpoint of the law, as God goes through the law and he talks about the people's interaction with creation, and he talks about how we think about creation, how we think about the animals in his creation, how we think about disease within his creation, and so forth. And so our mindset is going to be educated by that creator. Conversely, if we think that cosmology is arrived at in accidental ways, evolution, for instance, then we're going to potentially view things that are created by God as mere accidents, and therefore as disposable. Right? I mean, what does it matter, right? And so the importance that we place in our interaction that is going to flow out from, and I think there are a lot of people who might believe in God, but then because we live in a culture whose cosmology is saturated with that sort of chaotic product, that accidental product, they engage with cosmology not from the assumptions that come from a creator, but the assumptions that come from a disordered cosmology.
Exactly. And we've talked about, in Steve and I in previous conversations, we've talked about teleology, or telos, right, is the idea of an end or purpose, like what goal is it going for? And we both kind of were in agreement that cosmology is related to, so the order or the structure of the system is related to its purpose. Now, to be clear, not all philosophers, especially more materialistic, secular, atheistic philosophers, are going to divorce cosmology from teleology, because they're going to say, well, there's no purpose. This is not created for a specific end or anything of that nature. So your view of how the system is ordered and somewhat what created the system in and of itself is going to affect the purpose of it. And then also, what are the beings in that system? What are they like? And what is the system like in and of itself? And that kind of leads us to the idea of being. We can come back to cosmology, I guess, if you have more to say on that. But transitioning a little bit to ontology, it comes from ontos. And ontos is being in Greek. And so it's the study of being. And so usually when you're talking about cosmology, you're like, okay, what is the system? And sometimes philosophers will use parallel structures in the world to compare our system. So they'll say, oh, it's like a computer, or, oh, it's like a motor. Or sometimes reading some of the older philosophers, they talk about it being like a beehive. It's organized with this structure, because sometimes people will see hierarchy in the cosmos of, oh, this is ordered in a specific way. And then they'll try to pick a system that is like a parable or something put alongside to describe the order of the cosmos. Well, when you start down that line of saying, well, the universe is like this, then you have to start asking yourself the question is like, well, the objects or subjects or beings in that universe, what are they like? And well, do they have a function, and do they have a sub-function within that system, or do they have some broader, function altogether? And so this is where we start talking about like the ontology of humanity, the ontology of man. Who are we? And who are we in relationship to the cosmos is also another question. And you can even have more of a self-referential question on the ontos or the ontology of like, what does it mean to be a human? And a lot of art, a lot of philosophy has delved into that question. Obviously, we would argue the Bible fundamentally answers that question of ontology, of like who we are. And just like Stephen said in chapter 1 of Genesis, very clearly says we are made in God's image. We are worthy of, honor. We are the representatives or image bearers of God on this earth. And so the question of who we are is very much also tied into every single point of philosophy. Philosophy is any structured philosophy or serious philosophy is never going to leave the question of what is the cosmos or what are being just up in the air without definition. Obviously, there are maybe adherents or people who believe in certain things that they may not have that defined, but all serious philosophers and all serious philosophies as movements have always tried to provide some clear definition of what is the cosmos, how is it organized, and who are those in the cosmos, and who are we in relationship to that.
Yeah, and so obviously these are so closely tied together, but these are the questions that surround abortion debates, for instance, right? So if your cosmology is one of accident and not intentional order and creation, then your ontology is going to be that humans are on the level with animals. We're just more intelligent. We're more intelligent animals. Mm-hmm. And if we can destroy the lives of animals for our own usage, for our own food and so forth, then why not a baby? And so, because that has no greater ontology, right? It has no greater being or existence or meaning than any other form of life, which we destroy for our purposes and use it in other creative ways, hopefully. But even that, right? Should we? Does it matter? And so our commitment to creation will flow out of both cosmology and ontology. Our assigning of meaning to things and existence to things. What as he said, what does it mean to be human? And that really is the debate over abortion, is what does it mean to be human? And it ends up being, are you conscious? Are you able to make decisions? Are you self-aware? All these sorts of questions. And the uncomfortable part is that as they throw those various definitions, those various ontologies out there, what it means to be human, is it's pretty easy to find an exception to their rule. So, you got consciousness. All right. So then somebody who's in a coma is not a human anymore. Well, no, I don't mean that. And so you end up getting twisted around, whereas the Bible does offer us an ontology that supersedes all of those sort of subjective meanings. That is, we are created in the image of God. Mm-hmm. But it also offers an ontology to everything else in the world, that all this was created by God. Yep. And then it attaches that to us, or we're attached to that as those who exercise dominion over that we are put here as caretakers of that. And so we are coming in not blindly grasping for cosmology and ontology. As Christians, we come in and we're handed a cosmology and ontology. Say, here is the cosmology, here's the ontology. What philosophers mostly have done throughout history is either they don't have the scriptures, especially not completely revealed, like Plato and Aristotle. They're looking at nature and they're trying to discover cosmology and ontology, or as we get later in history, they've rejected the scriptures and they're trying to find an alternative cosmology and ontology from what the scriptures offer.
Yeah, amen. No, that's great. And on that, so what Stephen's saying is that our concepts of ontology are going to be kind of like the substrate. They're going to be like the foundation of all, or you'll hear arguments online and all this other stuff. And many times they're dealing with the like downstream questions or applications, like the symptoms of these deeper issues. And many times our language, even unbeknownst to us, carries forth arguments about ontology and cosmology. Like Stephen mentioned the abortion thing. What do many pro-abortionists want to say? It's not a baby, it's a fetus. Although fetus obviously in Latin means child, right? But what they were trying to do is change the vocabulary to change the mentality of the ontology. Well, it's not a human, it's not a baby. So really they're dealing with this question. And this is something too, even with cosmology. I know the people around me probably get annoyed, but a lot of people around me will say like, oh, Mother Nature. And I always get really cranky. I'm like, nope, do not say Mother Nature. Nature is not our mother. That's not in biblical cosmology. And I'm not just trying to be like, a grammar Nazi or just like get on everybody, but I'm trying to impress upon them like the way we talk presents a cosmology to things. And if we are saying Mother Nature, that has a whole system of cosmology that we as Christians don't affirm. There's pagan cosmology, or even, sometimes people talk about Mother Nature in more of a secular or completely materialistic cosmology that's there. And that's not what I want to do. I don't want to affirm a cosmology that is different than what the Bible is, that God is our father. Creation, as G.K. Chesterton says, is not our mother, she's our sister. And, so I don't have a problem if someone says sister creation. I know that's not really common, but the details of how we even use our vocabulary are reflective of these layers. And just like with construction in a house, if you don't have a good foundation, everything else is going to be out of whack. And so these questions are shared between theology, religion, and philosophy because we're getting down to the very bare bones of what reality is. So we're not just creating words for the sake of creating words. We're getting down to what is the fundamental aspect of reality that we live in and that we inhabit, and what should we start thinking about that? And so, the Bible is not a philosophical book conformed to human philosophies, but it's talking about the same thing. So to really understand human philosophy is to understand kind of the world's perspective on these things. It's not divorced from religion, as sometimes people want to say, oh, well, we can't touch religion, but we'll spend all day talking about philosophy. It's like, we're talking about the same thing, ultimately.
Yeah. And to, to understand the importance, the practical importance of this, that when all right, just think about in medicine. My wife and I talk about this a lot as far as, there's a lot of discussions about vaccines and about, what's best for your children. And I'm not here to question all of that in this episode. That's a longer and drawn out conversation, except to say that what I want to do is evaluate that from the premise of the right cosmology and ontology. So, I mean, just imagine, let's, in a separate conversation, imagine we know that sometimes people have a problem with their appendix, and then you have appendicitis, and then the easiest solution, the best solution that the doctors know of is to just remove the appendix. Mm-hmm. And as far as they can tell, that has far less effect than leaving the appendix in and trying other methods, right? So especially if it bursts, just take that out. All right. So what we recognize is a problem happened, diseases happen, things from the fall, right? But, however, the appendix is in everybody. So what if doctors said, listen, enough people have appendicitis, the easiest thing would just be to remove everybody's appendix. Now, because of my cosmology and my ontology, I believe God created the appendix. And in spite of what we know from our observations, what I know before that, what I know is that God created us. Now, medicine, the medical community is often coming from the place of maybe it serves no purpose at all, because evolution, right? Maybe it's lived out its purpose and it's useless now. And so one of the assumptions they're allowed to make because of their cosmology and ontology is that we may have useless parts of our body. Because of my cosmology,
vestigial organs,
right?
The evolutionary,
right? Because of my cosmology and ontology, I should not think such things,
right?
Because I'm looking at the body of this is God's creative product, so nothing is superfluous. And so I want to think in that way. And even if I can't discover the purpose of the appendix, I believe that the creator had purpose and that he had order. And so I'm going to approach that kind of conversation differently than somebody who doesn't believe that same thing. Now, I know doctors aren't saying that, but you could conceive, and there are situations where doctors lean in that direction because of the medical community at large, because at large, the medical community is coming from an evolutionary cosmology. Yep. And the resultant ontologies about the meaning of the cosmology. And so we've got to reframe, and we've got to not just go with that flow of that cosmology and ontology, but sort of step back and say, okay, we've got to ask different questions because we start from different assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And these have profound philosophical, spiritual implications, because we think about ontology. This is something I bring up with a lot of my studies with non-Christians starting off. I'll ask them the question. I'll say, do you believe that all humans should be treated with dignity and respect? And they'll say, yeah. I've not had a single study of all the hundreds of studies I've had. I've never had someone say, no, I think we can treat humans as garbage and whatever. Everyone's like, yeah, we deserve respect. And I say, okay, why? Well, because we're humans. Okay, well, wolves are wolves, dogs are dogs, and they can kill each other and stuff like that. Is that a problem for us? And this is where, you can start to see the breakdowns of the world's ontology or cosmology, because they want to inhabit various myths that they rob from Christian ontology. Christian ontology says you shouldn't kill your neighbor because your neighbor is made, sorry, I'm about to say that in Spanish. Conforme a imagen de Dios. No, like conform to or after God's image, right? And so that's where, they rob from that, and they've been created or raised in a Christian system. They like to have that, but then they want to go and say, well, we don't want the conclusions, the morality that is inherent in Christian ontology or Christian cosmology, that there is a God that we have to submit to, that we're going to be held accountable for. So we don't like the negative things. So we're going to just prop up evolutionary cosmology or evolutionary ontology and get away from the things we don't like with Christianity, but we're going to wink, wink, hint, nudge, nudge, keep all the good things about that Christian ontology that we want. Because really, if you take a evolutionary ontology that we are just animals, and I'll hear sometimes people say that, like humans are just intelligent animals. Okay, well, you have no problem squishing an ant or spraying poison to get rid of the ants that are coming into your house. If humans are no different in terms of our ontology, if there's no difference because the order of cosmology of us and ants, and you want to gas millions of other humans, there's no problem with that. And this is where we in like every part of our being, our ontology says, no, that is repulsive, that is immoral, that is terrible. And yet that's the consequence of these things. And so when obviously that's an extreme case, but actually kind of in some ways it's not that extreme, because a lot of people buy in that. Sadly, they don't want the conclusion of saying, yeah, we're fine with killing millions of people. But that's where, especially in the 20th century, we saw those visions of ontology and cosmology borne out, and people will say, oh, religion is the source of wars. Well, actually, these secularistic, materialistic cosmologies and ontologies have killed millions and millions and millions and more people than any religious war ever did throughout all of history. And so these are uncomfortable realities. But to be aware of this is also going to help us engage with people, and it's going to be able to help us understand, like, there may be other philosophies. Like we'll talk Lord willing, about modernism. Modernism has a particular, in certain branches of modernism, will view humans, or some humans and others, as being different in terms of their worth, their value, their function, in terms of the order or set. Whether we talk about economic theories, they're going to position humans in a certain ontological reality within that cosmos. And that will sometimes rub against what we say as Christians. And there may be some things that we just have kind of bought into because that's the world, that's the projected ontology or cosmology. But to critically engage these, we need to say, okay, this system of socialism, capitalism, Marxism, whatever, what is it saying about the worker? What is it saying about a human in this system, and what is the system? And then after we can kind of clearly define that from those vectors of ontology, cosmology, we need to ask the question, is that actually consistent? Does that go hand in hand with what the Bible said? Or is the adoption of this other system, whether it be philosophic or economic, whatever the case may be, if that's asking us to have a totally different sense of cosmology and ontology, we need to understand we can't inhabit that other system and still maintain our professions of Christian cosmology and ontology. So the consequences of these are very real. But sometimes we don't recognize the radical difference of proclamation because we're dealing with the symptoms, or we're kind of looking at maybe the whole, and we don't get down to understanding the foundations are radically different. So that's why we're trying to drill down and say, like, okay,
and what
cosmos and ontos are very important.
Right. And to, what I think happens a lot is we're just inconsistent, and we borrow from various cosmologies and ontologies as they are convenient for the moment. And I don't mean in some sinister way. It's just, it's sort of the path of least resistance, right? And so, so people, who would say, I don't believe in evolution, would then talk about cavemen and talk about, sort of primitive man, as if man has evolved, even though in another context, they would reject that notion, but then they still view history as the progression of the evolving of man. And they don't stop and think, wait, Adam was as intellectually capable as we are. Mm-hmm. He was not deficient. And in fact, I mean, if you think about it, there are many ways in which he probably was more intellectually capable than we are because of the fall. And so it's not a notion of some prehistoric, man that has developed over time and so forth. So I think we don't even understand. We're not. That's what philosophy is examining those assumptions, and it's trying to come to a consistency. And that's where philosophy, I think, has value, is asking those questions. Am I being consistent here? Am I thinking consistently about myself and my life and so forth? And the other thing about that Caleb mentioned is that I think sometimes we think, oh, that's just in academia. All of this is played out, right? And that's part of what we've been talking about, is the problems that we're seeing is those inconsistencies being exposed, and people coming to live more consistently with bad ontology and bad cosmology, and you see that at the fringes most of the time. Somebody like Peter Singer, if anybody's ever read Peter Singer, he's a philosopher and an ethicist, and Peter Singer just flat out says, look, an infant is less sentient than a rabbit. And so we should think no more of destroying a born baby than killing a rabbit for rabbit stew. He is being consistent. Mm-hmm. And what you have is people with the same cosmology and the same ontology as Peter Singer, who just don't like the conclusions. And so they're just going to be inconsistent. But the problem is, eventually, if we maintain, as a society, especially if we maintain cosmologies and ontologies, they will come out. Mm-hmm. And so that's what you saw. That's what you see as you study through philosophy. You see Darwin, for instance, developing this new notion of cosmology and ontology. And Darwin, who is raised in this sort of Christian sphere, says, yes, but don't take this there. right? Don't take this to its logical conclusions. What Darwin doesn't get to decide whether people take, if they truly buy into what he's saying, somebody's going to take it to its logical conclusions. And people did take it in many, many ways to its logical conclusions. So we don't, Darwin doesn't get off the hook by saying, I didn't want it to go there. Right. It was always going to go there if people subscribe to this.
Exactly. And that's where teleology is very helpful, because telos, right, is the end, it's the destiny, it's the product of what is going to be brought out here. And so what Stephen's saying here is super important, because you can look at the teleology of Darwinism, of evolution, and say, well, that's eugenics. Well, no, we don't want that. Well, that's the logical development of it. And so then you can kind of work backwards. If you can figure out what the telos is, you can kind of work backwards and say, okay, what's the ontology? What's the cosmology? Because teleology is downstream. It's somewhat more specific, and it is a little different, but it is built in and interconnected to cosmology, because Darwin had a cosmology. And one of the things with Darwin is that people had, if we go back and study history, people had concepts, and they were trying to divorce the cosmology of the world and everything away from God. But what they didn't have is they didn't have a good origin story. And origins are part of cosmology in many ways, and part of teleology also. But when Darwin provided his theory, it provided their origin story. And they're like, oh, now our cosmos has sense because we have a beginning, so to speak. And there's a lot of popularity and a lot of narrative significance and power in terms of what Darwin did, not just because he was one of the first, but because that was the missing piece for a cosmology. And when cosmology needs a coherent system to survive, because if you just came and said, hey, well, the cosmos is made of marshmallows and unicorns, well, that's not going to be very resonant with anybody. But if you can start to build a cosmos that starts to tether itself in some way of an explanatory power of reality, people are going to start paying attention. But just like the biblical cosmos has a beginning and it talks about ontology, the secular and materialist cosmology needed the same. And I know we're going to hopefully get into more of that, and also how various philosophies take different views on that. But one of the things, hopefully this is going to be a tool set for us in the future, is that when we compare modernism versus romanticism versus transcendentalism versus various forms of postmodernism, we'll come back to this question and say, okay, well, here's what they say. What is the cosmology? What are they saying about human experience and even the human? Because they may say, well, yeah, we believe in human dignity, but what is the ultimate source of human value? Is it the individual? Is it a collective? There's a lot of different ways that ontology breaks down, but hopefully keeping these categories is going to help us make those comparative notes, and then ultimately compare it back to the Bible and say, are they saying things that are true and reflective of the reality, biblical reality and ultimate reality, or are they making deviations? And then, as Stephen pointed out, what is the consequence of those deviations? Because you don't mess with ontology and cosmos and think it doesn't, it doesn't matter. Like as Galatians 6 says, you will reap what you sow. And that if you sow to a different cosmology and different ontology, you're going to reap a chaotic result. So,
yeah. So let me add one more thing, and then I think this will take us into our final category here to ontology, and that is that it deals with existence. What does it mean for something to exist? So, from the standpoint of humans, in addition to that sort of purpose, we're created in who are we? What defines us? We're created in the image of God. That points to something non-tangible about humans that makes them distinct from the rest of creation. That God gave man a soul. What is a soul? And this gets into notions about our brains. They're not just organic computers, or that we are not just organic computers. That there is something more than the physical to us. And then that gets into broader concepts of reality. Is there more in existence than we can see and touch? And does something have to be tangible and measurable in order to have existence? And so we operate in a world whose ontology is rooted in materialism, right? That we can only discover ontology through measurements and through observation and so forth, which gets us into this third category of thinking, which is epistemology. Mm-hmm. How do we know things? And that's what, again, breaking that down, you
have episteme, which is knowledge,
right,
and then the ology. So there's different words in Greek for knowledge, but this particular one, episteme, is like how do we discern, how do we know, how do we comprehend?
Yes. And so epistemology, I've heard this one probably in talking about discussions of philosophy more often than even the others, because it gets down to how can we know things, and how do we know things? Not just how can we, but how do we? So epistemology would be both the study of gaining knowledge, but then also questioning the knowledge you already have. Like how did you arrive at that conclusion? And philosophies are going to be pretty radically divergent on this. And they're also, I think, very often going to take false dichotomies in epistemology. Like knowledge is through the transmission of language, right? That's knowledge, is that we read something and then we know it. But then what that does is diminishes experiential knowledge. Mm-hmm. Well, then on the other hand, somebody's going to take experiential knowledge. That's really the only way. So like if you take a class in school, you don't really know, right? Well, you know something. You don't know everything, but you do know something. And the person who goes by experience, well, he's anecdotal in his knowledge. He knows something that maybe the school guy doesn't, but there may be something the school person knows and understands about that, having read about it, that the person who's only learning from experience doesn't know yet, because his experience is limited, whereas this other form of knowledge allows him access to more information at one time. And so sometimes those epistemologies that ought to work in harmony are pitted against each other. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you have people coming in and saying, there's no such thing, right? That all of your experiences or propositional knowledge, it's all lies, and that you really don't know anything. So it's pretty important, what we think about how we learn and how we know.
Yeah, and there's so much that this is probably like the philosopher's most favorite category to discuss. Because there's a lot of speculation. There's so many different ways that you can take this, and there's so many different like fun thought experiments that come in terms of how do we know what we know. And it's really kind of, it shakes the very foundation, because it's like, well, I know this. And we're going to get to Descartes, hopefully to discuss him sometime in modernism. But Descartes dealing with the question of epistemology. Most all philosophers touch on some form of epistemology of how do we know what we know. The Bible talks about it, not in terms of like epistemology, but the Bible's filled with discussions of knowing. And this is something where I know for myself, I never thought about it. It's just, you take for granted the idea of knowing, of thinking, of reasoning, of even perception. And if your perception is consistent with the things that you're seeing around you, that has to do with epistemology. Like, do we actually discern and perceive real things in the world? Or is this just all some type of matrix, to borrow more 20th century framing of it? Is this just a simulation? And those things have been debated about a whole lot. And this is something that I think more and more Christians are recognizing how important it is, because the Apostle Paul actually deals with this, I believe, quite a bit in Acts chapter 17 when he goes to Athens. And he talks about, in God we live and move and have our very being. And there's a way that the ancients perceived the world around them, but many of them took for granted that perception was actually reflective of reality, or in the ways that they drew conclusions from the reality, it was not reflective of the reality. But not many of the ancients really struggled with the idea of like, am I actually beholding reality? And we have become somewhat more adept at asking that question, because now we have things that are processed and digital, and we understand that there's somewhat of a difference between something that can be processed and something that can inhabit a physical reality. And there's a lot of break and a lot of consequence, and I don't want to get into all of that just because that's beyond the scope of this conversation. But the world has really been struggling with this, and many times most of the sciences, they will skip right over this. They do not like this question. It makes them feel uncomfortable. If you talk to a scientist and they say, well, we know that the earth is, such and such billion years old, or we know that atoms behave in this capacity. And it's like, how do you know that? Well, we've observed them. How do you know your observation is correct? Well, it has to be. But what if it's not? Don't want to think about it, because that will just cause a Jenga collapse and everything will come tumbling down. And so this is where philosophers really like to kind of jump in on this. And now for Christians, people might think, well, what's the benefit of even thinking about this? Well, because humans have a discernible perception of reality, that we can know that knowledge is not just some, arrogant perception, but the Bible talks about knowing in real means, as Stephen pointed out. That presents a different ontology, cosmology, and the ways that we know, epistemology from what the competing values of the world. Because ultimately, a perspective outside of what we're calling a grounded, meaning grounded is it's tethered, it has a connection to something real. If you don't have a grounded epistemology, everything turns into nihilism of nothing. Like, you cannot know, and you go down the rabbit hole, and there is just more rabbit hole. There's just nothing and nothing and nothing. And it is very shocking. And this is why a lot of philosophers, when they dive into epistemology, seem seductive, but some of them even have psychotic breaks, because if you cannot even have confidence in the fact that you know anything, where's your reality? And then reality crumbles. And if your reality crumbles, like, your cosmos is broken, your ontology is broken, everything's broken. I hope all that made sense, but epistemology is really important. It's in some ways kind of like the ground by which we can even start to evaluate the cosmos and the ontos.
Yeah, and just like with cosmology and ontology, we've fractured and accepted an inconsistent epistemology, right? So we've accepted the sort of materialistic. You can really know things that are tangible, and you can't really know things that are intangible.
Yeah,
and so that those end up being your personal held beliefs. And then we say, math, that's not your personal belief, that's reality.
Yeah.
But that God exists is the fundamental reality. And if you allow God's existence at the very base to be put into the realm of a not knowable thing, then what you've done is you've pulled as you reference Jenga, you've pulled the whole system down. Mm-hmm. And then you're pretending, this is what Nietzsche really was exposing, you're pretending to live in a system that was built on an assumption without that fundamental assumption. And so eventually the things that are built on that will also go away. And I think this is why people are struggling, because they've sort of accepted that inconsistency for so long, and they thought that we could maintain that inconsistency, that now that people are challenging things that we think are just reality, math and science, observations and so forth. And they're even, saying, math is a social construct or whatever. And like, from the standpoint of where they're coming from and where we're coming from in a lot of ways, they're not wrong. That math is, if God doesn't exist, then we're all just floating around, and we are telling ourselves stories to imagine order where there really is none. And to imagine knowledge where there really is none. Things are ever changing, they don't have meaning, and there's no meta narratives and things of that nature. And so they are the ones being consistent, and we've got to back up and say, no, the first assumption, or the first truth, is God. He is the first truth, and everything stands or falls with this. And so this is part of the epistemology question, right? And so what people want to do is put religious questions over here into a category of not knowable, and then we can separately investigate these other questions. So to put it this way, it's the difference between you can know 2 + 2 is 4. But how do you know if a book is a good book? And they would say on the second question, that's not something you can know. But I think that's a mistake to say. Now, are they known in the same ways? No. There's a distinction in the nature of how we know those things, how we arrive at those conclusions, but they're rooted. The evaluation and the knowledge is still rooted in the same thing, which is God's existence. My evaluation of a book has to start with, who is God?
Yep.
And that's how I arrive at that conclusion. But my knowledge of whether 2 + 2 equals 4, whether I like it or not, is rooted in, is this an ordered universe or is it not?
Yep.
And if it is not, then I'm just making stuff up.
Yeah. And what Stephen's talking about, I've seen it impact Christians. This past year, I was talking to a young man, a Christian, and we started talking about things that we know. And he had some questions, and doubts about, maybe he had questions about the Bible and which book should be in the Bible. And I was talking about like what we can know about the history of the Bible. And he goes, well, that's not like really knowing facts. I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, that knowledge is good and all that about knowledge of church and the Bible and history, but that's not like real knowledge. I was like, what do you mean by real knowledge? It's like, scientific facts. I was like, okay. So I'm sure all of us have heard something like that, right? But this was coming from a Christian, and like right there, he's demonstrating this tension, right, that Stephen's talking about, with the idea like, okay, there's a difference of cosmology, and that young man is trying to kind of take two different epistemologies of knowledge, of like the way the world says and projects, like, oh, these are real things that you can discernibly know, and knowledge is an actual, like, firm, immovable, 100% confident reality that you can put all of your confidence on. But then God, the Bible, history, these are not knowable things. It's a subtle shift of epistemology, and one that, as we will hopefully, Lord willing, evaluate some of these more systems, that sounds good on a level, but is not consistent, and it does not hold. It's kind of like looking at a house. If you're buying a house, and it's got really good siding, it's got a really great roof, and you're like, got a great roof. But then you go down and you look, and the floor is out of level, the doors won't shut, the whole thing is all messed up, and you're like, I'm not going to buy this house. The foundation is a wreck. Well, that's kind of what's happened, is we've been in this whole system where the epistemologies of the world have been projected, and they say, well, look at all the good that we can do with our epistemologies. Look at what we can hope and provide, and we can bring people in together under the epistemology of science or secularism or whatever the case may be. And then they're just like, well, don't look over there. Don't look at the foundation that is totally inconsistent, and we don't have any real basis of having any confidence in our faculties or our perceptions, etc.
Yeah.
So epistemology, I think one of the reasons it gets so much attention from philosophers, and it deserves that, is because it's really foundational. Because if you don't really even understand how you know what you know, then how do you have any confidence to say anything about ontology or the cosmos or even any of the daily interactions or facts around your life? And hopefully, Lord willing, as we get into the analysis of some more of these different systems, we'll be able to like demonstrate the decisions that certain philosophers make about epistemology. And one of the really, if you've discerned it this far, that's great. But what Stephen said and what I'm saying is so much of modern philosophy robs Christian epistemology without really engaging with it. They want to just take it because the Christian epistemology makes sense. And it allows for humans to be positioned as ontological people who can reason and epistemologically have confidence that their perception and their reason, their thinking, is actual truth and grounded and tethered to something. Well, everyone wants that, but there's not a lot of philosophies that actually provide for any meaningful reality or ground for that assertion. And so basically what modern philosophy has done is been like, well, we don't have an answer for epistemology. We're just going to shovel in the Christian epistemology while rejecting the rest of Christianity. And that hasn't served very well for them. And then the others that have rejected Christian epistemology, well, we're reaping the chaos of those systems as well. But it's very important. I know it can seem very like heady, very abstract, and some of it is. But the great thing with the depth of Christian epistemology is it doesn't negate reality, and it provides a grounded system that our perception is reliable, our thinking is reliable, but it's grounded in God and it's grounded in the reality of the system. And so that's something that only really Christian epistemology has that benefit. But I hope that makes sense. I know we're getting into the deep end on some of this stuff.
Yeah, and so just to summarize, cosmology is about the order around us, where it comes from, how, in what ways it's ordered and so forth. Ontology has got to do with meaning and what existence, why does it exist, those types of questions. And then epistemology is, how do we learn things? How do we know things? How do we know what we know? How can you know? How can you gain more knowledge? And so we're going to be, the reason we're bringing up these words is because philosophers are going to use these words, right? Or they're going to talk in these categories. And so as we go through, we're going to be comparing and saying, here are some of the assumptions about cosmology or ontology or epistemology that crept in through this philosophy that then had this effect downwind, right? And so as we're talking about the problems, we want to go back and say, where does this start, right? Where does this idea begin that then germinates and blossoms out into this problem that we're dealing with now? Because all of these problems, I mean, in some way, you could just generically say all the problems start from sin. Yes, but if we're trying to root out bad ideas without just destroying civilization, right? Then what we're trying to do is be surgical and say, okay, here was a bad philosophy. And usually what you'll find is it's a philosopher who is answering some of the questions right and some of them wrong. And we don't want to just dismiss everything because some wrong crept in along the way. We're trying to arrive at a more accurate philosophy through a knowledge of Scripture. And what we're trying to do is weed out and say, where has that crept into my own thinking? Right. It's not I'm trying to root it out for the sake of those philosophers. I'm trying to root it out because I want to see where that's crept into my own thinking and where that might have consequences, not just my thinking, my family, the church here, my community, my circle. Where is that creeping in that I need to make adjustments and say, okay, I've bought into this false philosophy.
Right. And on that, Stephen, you're right in the sense that it all kind of goes back to sin, but I don't think that's a helpful frame, as you just mentioned, because I think many Christians have this concept of sin as, it's a explicit transgression of God's law. That's what a sin is.
Mhm.
And so if I say Mother Nature, am I sinning? Well, I can't say that you're sinning, but are you on the route to communicating a proper cosmology that's reflective of God's reality? No.
Yeah.
Does that matter? Most people might say, no, it doesn't matter because at least I'm not sinning. And sin is not that easily demonstrated. You know, the biblical narrative teaches us time after time that we deceive ourselves and we fall into these movements of apostasy that oftentimes start with small deviations, and they start with these differences of cosmology, ontology, or epistemology, and they end up to be full-blown apostasies or immoralities later on. But where does it start? In the germination period, many times it starts there. And so I'm not trying to say, oh, you're a full-out sinner if you say Mother Nature. But I think sometimes people kind of overlook the importance of all these things we're talking about because it doesn't fall into their binary category of sin, not sin. And that's not the most helpful way to look at it. It's not a wise way to look at it biblically either. And hopefully we'll be able to get to talk about, some more of that in the future, even in terms of like, what is our concept of sin? How do we understand sin, even biblically? Because we might think we're just taking the Bible. But as Stephen said, if we've had society and thousands of years of the conditioning of the world, we have to be careful that the way that we view cosmology, ontology, and epistemology, even reading the Bible, we may be filtering the Bible through all these other lenses instead of taking God's vision and his cosmology, his ontology, his epistemology as it should be. And so the simplistic lens of, well, this is not sin, why are we even talking about it? I don't think that's helpful. And I think it obfuscates a lot of issues. And so we're trying to
understand that the process leading to sin is not always immediate.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's way downstream. And because it's so far downstream, that's why we have a hard time tracking it back to the philosophy that got us there, right? The thought processes that were errant thought processes that weren't sin at their inception, but began to get us off the path, whether individually or culturally. And it's even harder culturally because then you're talking about, ages and ages of divergence. And by the time it's recognizable, you're so far downwind that it takes a long time to get back to where did this start? Where did this thought process start?
And as you said, you don't want to just go in with a wrecking hammer and destroy everything.
Right.
Because if you go in and you destroy everything, even the parts of human philosophy that are reflecting a biblical cosmos, ontology, and epistemology, then what you're going to do is you're going to destroy everything, and you're going to be just going to a reactionary back and forth between bad systems, trying to solve one little problem of this, and you're going to have the instability. And this is what I love about Ephesians 4. Paul says that we as a church, as the body of Christ, are to maintain or to strive to attain the maturity of the faith. And why? So that we will no longer be tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine. Because if you're just kind of reacting, and which is what our society does, what they do in politics, it's just this reactionary, and they're not understanding the foundations. They're not letting God build the system as he would. There's always going to be instability. There's always going to be chaos that's going to reign. And so we have to be careful on this. It's just like a remodel job with a house. You don't want to go in and just blow up the whole house. You've got to figure out where the parts that are wrong, why did they go wrong? And if we make an adjustment, are we really making the proper adjustment that is reflective of the biblical truth? Or are we just making a reactive one that puts us into another human philosophy?
I think about people looking at the 1950s and saying, I see a lot of things better in the 1950s than now. Mm-hmm. I could agree. I could see some of those things, but you're still going to a flawed philosophy that in many ways is going to lead you right back to here. But you're already off the path. You just aren't as far down that path as we are now. Mm-hmm. And so the temptation is to view, it's like, I think I've mentioned it already. It's like Jehu going back to Jeroboam's sins. Maybe that's better than Ahab, but it's not where we need to be.
Right. Because using our framework, right, of even that comparison in the 1950s, or if you want to talk about Jehu to Ahab to Jeroboam, what is the cosmology? What is the ontology? What is the epistemology? And if fundamentally maybe the excess is different, but the foundation is the same, you're going to be going right back to the same situation. And so that's, I think, a really important point Stephen is stressing, is that these movements of cosmology, ontology, and epistemology are longitudinal. They are very long. They do not just change overnight. They don't even change really very quickly from generation to generation. They may change somewhat in terms of the detail or how polished or the way that it's moved, but we're talking about the deeper, more like deep-seated ones. And the ontology of the Gen Zers today is not different from the ontology of the 1950 American. The execution of the context may be different, but their understanding of the cosmos, of who they are, their ontology, and then how they know hasn't really changed that much, which is what Stephen's point is if you just change the trappings, but you go back with the same foundations, eventually those foundations are going to bring about the same consequences. And so that's why we've got to look beyond just the modality of the context or the fashion of what we're seeing and get down to the heart. And that's what these tools of order, cosmos, ontos, being, and then episteme of knowledge, that's what we're really trying to get. And hopefully this will not only help us in our conversation with each other and with everybody else have a basis of comparison, but even for someone listening to this, they'll be able to start thinking in these terms. If you watch a movie, start asking yourself, what's the cosmos projected of this story of this movie? What's the ontology of who the person is and who they want me to be? And what are they saying about knowledge? And so I think it's just a really helpful framework that is consistent with the biblical view, and it helps us start analyzing things better. So
yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of leave it with this, I mentioned we want to be surgical. I mean, some people have jokingly said, the problem begins in Genesis 3. Even there, what Eve says is that she saw that the tree was good for food, that it was delight to the eyes and desirable to make one wise. Mm-hmm. All three of those things are good things, right? That beauty, something that looks good, this is a good thing. To be delightful, good for food. God created food for us. And the knowledge, the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge, good things. What she had done is pursued those things without God. But if we're not careful, then we can become ascetics who assume that the pursuit of the food, the pursuit of beauty, the pursuit of knowledge and understanding, that these are the problems. That's not the problem. Mm-hmm. And so if we're not careful about the philosophies as we're trying to root out the problems, we actually go attack the wrong bases, the wrong foundations, mm-hmm. and end up with bad solutions that are going to be overreactions and end us up in a whole nother errant philosophy. So we want to be careful and thoughtful and say, here are the false assumptions, and these are the problems. But maybe those false assumptions were arrived at in pursuit of answers to valid questions. And I think that's what we need to understand. Philosophy is asking valid questions very often and just arriving very often at false conclusions.
Amen. Amen. Well, do we tee up the preview for the next conversation?
Yeah. So as we're continuing on here in our investigation of all of these things, we're moving towards causes. And so we're going to start kind of walking through a little bit of the progression of these philosophies. We're going to start talking about modernism and probably some of the precursors leading up to that and so forth. But some of the thought processes that come out of modernism, and the buzzword among a lot of brethren is postmodernism. Mm-hmm. Yes, but that is a reaction to something that was false assumptions that were already in place. And I think that doesn't usually get as much attention. So we're going to spend a little bit of time developing the idea of modernism. What are the false assumptions of modernism, and how are those still hanging around today?
Yeah, and hopefully use the same framework of what were the battle lines, because it's very easy to talk about these things in terms of monolithic things like, oh, modernism is a thing, postmodernism is a thing. It is in a way, but it was formed through a lot of back and forth arguments about these, and some of them did never get like resolved, but kind of were borne out in various actions or applications, whether politically or through industry, economically, etc. And one of the things that I'm looking forward to is talking about the epistemological issues with modernism, because that's, I think, maps very well the history of modernism, and it kind of provides one of the major splits that we'll talk more with the difference of rationalism versus empiricism, and how there's a lot that once you start understanding those fault lines and battle lines, you can start to really kind of get a broader picture without getting lost in the weeds of all the dates and the names of the philosophers. If you can kind of understand what's at stake and what they're arguing over, then I think you can kind of get a bigger picture of, oh, okay, now I see why postmodernism developed from modernism.
Yeah.
But hopefully we'll be able to get in and explain.
Yeah, and I hope we'll see that. Yeah, the context that these are not just philosophies that rose up out of nothing. Somebody just twiddling their thumbs with too much time on their hand. That these philosophies rose up out of trying to answer difficult questions. And they're questions that we still need to be wrestling with today, or rather, they're questions that we need to be seeking answers from God's word and from His wisdom and His revelation for. And so there are answers to the questions, and so we'll talk about that as we move forward. But appreciate it, Caleb, and we'll look forward to next time.
Amen.
All right.